There is a distinct sound a heavy V-twin engine makes when it idles, a deep, guttural heartbeat that rattles your ribs. Now multiply that by 60. When 3 entitled high school bullies decided to brutalize the quietest kid in town, they thought they were untouchable. They had no idea who his uncle was. Oak Ridge High School was a typical brick-and-mortar fortress nestled in the affluent suburbs of Westfield, New Jersey. It was a place where social hierarchies were carved in stone by the time you reached sophomore year. At the very top of that food chain sat Trent Gallagher. Trent's father owned the largest chain of auto dealerships in the tri-state area, which meant Trent drove a brand-new lifted truck through the biggest parties and operated under the unspoken assumption that the rules and the law did not apply to him. He was flanked by his 2 permanent shadows, Brody Hayes and Colin Mercer, both starting linebackers who treated high school like their own personal kingdom. At the absolute bottom of that same food chain was Tracy Weaver. Tracy was 15, rail-thin, and inherently quiet. He was the kind of kid who walked the hallways, staring at the linoleum tiles, desperately trying to blend into the lockers. Tracy had been born with partial hearing loss in his left ear and wore a beige, slightly bulky hearing aid that he constantly tried to hide beneath a mop of unruly brown hair. He wasn't entirely antisocial. He just preferred the company of his charcoal pencils and his sketchbook to the cruel, chaotic noise of high school. His mother, Brenda, worked double shifts as a palliative care nurse just to keep a roof over their heads in a town they could barely afford. Tracy knew how hard she worked, and his primary goal in life was to survive until graduation without causing her an ounce of trouble. But in high school, predators have a 6th sense for vulnerability. The trouble started on a humid Tuesday in late October. The dismissal bell had just violently rung, flooding the hallways with exhausted teenagers. Tracy was at his locker, carefully placing his history textbook into his battered backpack. He didn't hear Trent approach from his blind side. Trent slammed Tracy's locker door shut, missing Tracy's fingers by a fraction of an inch. The loud metallic bang echoed down the corridor, silencing the students nearby. "Hey, deaf kid," Trent sneered, leaning heavily against the neighboring locker. Brody and Colin snickered from behind him, acting as a human wall to block anyone from intervening. "You didn't do the Spanish worksheet for me. I told you I needed it by 4th period." Tracy kept his eyes on his sneakers, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. I didn't have time, Trent. I had to study for my own exams." Trent's jaw tightened. In his world, no was not an acceptable answer, especially not from someone he deemed a peasant. He reached out and snatched the sketchbook out of Tracy's hands. "Give that back," Tracy said, his voice trembling, but laced with a sudden, uncharacteristic urgency. That book was his sanctuary. "What's in here?" Trent mocked, flipping carelessly through the pages. Beautiful, highly detailed charcoal sketches of vintage motorcycles, panheads, knuckleheads, custom choppers, flashed by. Tracy drew them from memory, an obsession he'd harbored since he was a little boy. "Drawing toy bikes? What are you, 6 years old?" Trent ripped a page out. The sound of the tearing paper was louder than the locker slam to Tracy. "Stop!" Tracy lunged, driven by a sudden spike of adrenaline. He grabbed Trent's wrist. It was a fatal mistake. To Trent, this was an unforgivable public challenge. He shoved Tracy hard in the chest, sending him stumbling back against the metal lockers. "Back parking lot. After the buses leave," Trent whispered, his eyes dark and venomous. "Or tomorrow, I start putting these pages up all over the school with your mum's phone number on them." He tossed the book onto the floor, stepping deliberately on the cover, leaving a muddy footprint before walking away with his crew. Tracy spent the next hour hiding in the boys' bathroom, nausea rolling in his stomach. He knew he should go to a teacher, but he also knew the reality of Oak Ridge High. Trent's dad bought the school its new football stadium scoreboard. The administration would find a way to make it Tracy's fault, or worse, chalk it up to a mutual altercation, resulting in a suspension that his mother simply couldn't handle. At 4:15 p.m., the school grounds were eerily abandoned. The autumn wind whipped dry leaves across the cracked asphalt of the lower parking lot, hidden behind the concrete bleachers of the football field. Tracy walked out, clutching the straps of his backpack, hoping Trent had gotten bored and gone home. He hadn't. Trent, Brody, and Colin were sitting on the tailgate of Trent's truck. As soon as they saw Tracy, they hopped down. There were no words exchanged. There was no grand speech. Brody grabbed Tracy from behind, pinning his arms while Trent stepped up. The first punch caught Tracy square in the stomach, knocking the wind out of him instantly. He folded forward, gasping for air that wouldn't come. Colin kicked his legs out from under him, and Tracy hit the asphalt hard, scraping his palms and cheek. "You don't touch me," Trent hissed, standing over him. "Ever!" For 3 agonizing minutes, they treated Tracy like a heavy bag. It wasn't a fight, it was a methodical beating. Tracy curled into a tight ball, protecting his head, taking kicks to his ribs, his back, his thighs. In the scuffle, his hearing aid was dislodged, tumbling onto the rough asphalt. Trent saw it. He walked over, picked up the beige device, and looked down at the bleeding, gasping boy. "Please," Tracy wheezed, a tear cutting through the dirt and blood on his face. "My mum. It costs too much. Please." Trent smiled, a cold, empty smile. He dropped the hearing aid onto the pavement and brought the heel of his heavy work boot down on it. The plastic cracked and shattered into a dozen pieces. "See you tomorrow, deaf kid," Trent laughed. The 3 of them climbed into the truck, the engine roaring to life, and peeled out of the parking lot, leaving Tracy lying alone in the cold dusk. The walk home took over an hour. Every step was a masterclass in agony. Tracy's ribs screamed with every breath, and his right eye was rapidly swelling shut. The world on his left side was reduced to a muffled, disorienting silence, without his hearing aid. When he finally pushed open the front door of their small, dimly lit apartment, his mother, Brenda, was at the kitchen table sorting through a stack of final notice utility bills. She looked up, and the color instantly drained from her face. "Tracy! Oh my God, Tracy!" She knocked her chair backward, rushing to him just as his knees gave out. She caught him, easing him onto the worn living room carpet. Her hands shook as she took in the blood on his t-shirt, the split lip, the dark bruising already forming along his jawline. "Mum, I'm sorry," he whispered, crying now that the adrenaline had completely faded. "I'm sorry. They broke it. I couldn't stop them." "Shh, baby, don't talk. We have to go to the hospital." The emergency room at St. Jude's Medical Center was a chaotic blur. Tracy was diagnosed with 2 fractured ribs, a minor concussion, and a severe laceration above his eye that required 8 stitches. While a nurse tended to him, Brenda demanded the hospital call the police. Officer Miller, a 20-year veteran of the Westfield police force, arrived an hour later. He took his notes with a startling lack of enthusiasm. When Tracy finally named Trent Gallagher, the officer's pen stopped. Miller sighed, scratching his chin. "Look, Brenda, I'll go talk to the boy and his parents. But unless there's security footage behind those bleachers, and there isn't, it's 3 boys' words against 1. Trent Gallagher is an honor roll student. His dad practically funds the police athletic league. If we push this without hard evidence, Gallagher's lawyers will turn this around and say your boy started it. They might even sue for defamation. It happens." Brenda stared at the officer, her vision blurring with tears of pure, helpless rage. "So they just get away with nearly killing my son? They destroyed his medical device. Do you know what a hearing aid costs?" "I'm just telling you the reality of the situation, Mom," Miller said softly, avoiding her gaze. "I'll file the report, but I wouldn't hold your breath for an arrest." When the officer left, Brenda stood in the sterile hospital corridor, leaning against the cold wall. She looked through the small window of the hospital door at Tracy, her gentle, kind boy, broken and defeated, sleeping under a thin white blanket. The system was going to do absolutely nothing. Trent Gallagher would go to school tomorrow, laugh with his friends, and Tracy would have to live in terror. Brenda closed her eyes. She made a vow 12 years ago when Tracy was just a toddler. She promised she would cut ties with her past, that she would raise her son in a safe, normal world, far away from the life her family lived. But looking at her bruised son, that vow shattered. Normal wasn't working. The safe world had failed them. She pulled her cell phone from her purse, her hands trembling. She scrolled down to a contact saved simply as Arthur. It rang 4 times before a voice answered, a deep, gravelly baritone over the background noise of clinking glasses and a jukebox. "Brenda!" The voice sounded genuinely shocked. "It's been a long time, little sister." "Artie!" Brenda choked out, a sob finally escaping her throat. "I need your help." Arthur Bear Pendleton wasn't just Brenda's older brother. He was the sergeant-at-arms for the East Coast Charter of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. "Where are you?" The background noise on the phone instantly ceased. The jovial tone was gone, replaced by a cold, sharpened steel. "St. Jude's Hospital, ER Room 4. "I'm 10 minutes out." He arrived in 7. The automatic doors of the emergency room hissed open, and the atmosphere in the waiting area physically shifted. Arthur stood 6'4", a mountain of a man with a thick, greying beard and eyes that had seen far too much violence. He wore heavy boots, faded denim, and his leather cut, the infamous winged death's head patched boldly on the back. A jagged scar ran down the side of his neck. He didn't stop at the reception desk. He walked straight through the double doors, the security guard taking one look at the patches and deciding to look the other way. Brenda met him in the hallway. She didn't say a word, just pointed into Tracy's room. Arthur walked in. Tracy woke up, his good eye widening in shock. He had only seen photos of his Uncle Artie, and none of them did the giant justice. Arthur stood beside the hospital bed, looking at the stitches, the dark bruises, and finally, the plastic bag on the bedside table containing the crushed pieces of the hearing aid. Arthur gently placed a massive, calloused hand on Tracy's uninjured shoulder. "Who did this, Si?" Tracy looked at his mother, then back at the giant biker. "A kid named Trent Gallagher, and his friends. Did you fight back?" "I tried," Tracy whispered, ashamed. "There were 3 of them." Arthur's face showed no emotion, but his grip on Tracy's shoulder was steady and reassuring. "There's no shame in getting knocked down by cowards, boy. The only shame is letting cowards think they won." Arthur turned to Brenda. "The police?" "Officer came," Brenda said bitterly. "Said Trent's daddy is too rich. Said it's their word against Tracy's. They aren't going to do a damn thing, Artie. Trent told Tracy he'd be waiting for him tomorrow." Arthur nodded slowly. He didn't shout. He didn't throw anything. The terrifying thing about men like Arthur Pendleton was their absolute calmness in the face of conflict. "Brenda, take the boy home. Lock the doors. Get some sleep." "Artie, what are you going to do? Please, don't go to jail over this." Arthur kissed his sister's forehead. "I'm not doing anything illegal, Bren. I'm just going to make sure my nephew has a safe escort to school tomorrow." Arthur walked out of the hospital into the cool autumn night. He pulled his phone from his leather vest and dialed his chapter president. "Yeah, Bear, what's up?" "Need a favor, boss," Arthur said, lighting a cigarette. "My nephew got jumped. 3 rich kids. Broke his ribs and smashed his hearing aid. Cops are looking the other way." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. "What do you need?" "I need every breathing brother who can ride. Call the Nomads. Call the Prospects. Call the secondary charter down in Trenton. We ride at dawn." "Done," the president said. Miles away, in his massive suburban bedroom, Trent Gallagher fell asleep playing video games, completely convinced that the world belonged to him. He had absolutely no idea that in basements, garages, and clubhouses across 3 different counties, heavy leather jackets were being pulled on, and 60 massive V-twin engines were warming up in the dark. Wednesday morning broke over Westfield with a crisp, biting chill. Inside the Weaver apartment, the silence was heavy. Tracy sat at the edge of his bed, staring at his sneakers. His right eye was swollen into a grotesque canvas of purple and yellow, the black stitches stark against his pale skin. Every time he took a breath, his taped ribs flared with a sharp, stabbing ache. "I can't go," Tracy whispered. His voice was flat, devoid of the panic from the day before, replaced now by a hollow resignation. "Mum, please." He said he'd be waiting. "If I go, he's going to finish it." Brenda stood in the doorway, holding his winter coat. Her eyes were red-rimmed from a sleepless night, but her jaw was set with a fierce, unyielding resolve. "You are going, Tracy. If you hide today, you will hide for the rest of your life. Put your coat on." "Mum, Tracy, trust me, please." Reluctantly, agonizingly, Tracy pulled his arms through the sleeves, wincing as the fabric pulled against his bruised back. He picked up his backpack, noticeably lighter without the heavy sketchbook Trent had ruined. They walked out the front door and down the 2 flights of stairs to the modest parking lot of their complex. It was 7:15 a.m. The sky was a pale, bruised blue. "Where's the car?" Tracy asked, noticing Brenda's beat-up Honda Civic was nowhere to be seen. "We're not taking the car today," Brenda said, zipping up her own jacket. Before Tracy could ask what she meant, he felt it. He didn't hear it first. He felt the vibration in the soles of his shoes. It started as a low tremor in the asphalt, like the warning signs of an earthquake. Then, the sound hit the air. A deep, resonant, unified roar that seemed to swallow the entire neighborhood. Tracy turned his head, his good eye widening in absolute disbelief. Turning the corner onto their quiet, tree-lined suburban street was a tidal wave of chrome, black leather, and heavy machinery. They rode in a staggered, disciplined formation, taking up the entire width of the road. 10 bikes, 20, 40. It just kept coming. The morning sun caught the gleam of customized exhaust pipes and polished ape-hanger handlebars. At the very front of the pack rode Arthur Bear Pendleton, sitting tall on a massive, custom-built Harley-Davidson Road King. Next to him rode a man with silver hair tied back in a neat ponytail, wearing a leather cut adorned with the President patch. Neighbors pulled their curtains back. People stepping out to grab their morning papers froze on their lawns, coffee mugs suspended mid-air. The affluent, sheltered bubble of Westfield had never seen anything like this. 60 fully patched members of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club were rolling down Elm Street, and they were heading straight for Tracy Weaver. Arthur pulled his heavy bike up right to the curb where Tracy and Brenda stood, the massive V-twin engine idling with a rhythmic, guttural thump-thump-thump. The 59 other riders fell into a perfectly orchestrated perimeter, shutting off their engines in a synchronized wave of silence that was somehow more intimidating than the noise. Arthur kicked his stand down and stepped off. He walked over to Tracy, looking down at the boy's battered face. A muscle twitched in Arthur's jaw, the only sign of the violent anger boiling beneath his calm exterior. "Morning, Si," Arthur grumbled. He turned to the silver-haired man who had dismounted next to him. "Tracy, this is Thomas. We call him Dutch. He's the president of our charter." Dutch stepped forward. He didn't look like a cartoonish thug. He looked like a seasoned military general. He had cold, intelligent blue eyes and a handshake that felt like a steel vice. "It's an honor to meet you, Tracy. Your uncle told us you had a bit of a rough day yesterday." Yeah," Tracy stammered, completely overwhelmed. "Well, today is going to be a better day," Dutch said, his voice carrying effortlessly over the quiet street. He looked around at the 60 men surrounding them. "These are your brothers now, and nobody touches our brothers." Arthur reached into one of his hard saddle bags and pulled out a spare leather vest, heavy and worn. He draped it carefully over Tracy's shoulders. It was comically large on the thin teenager, but as the heavy leather settled over his bruised ribs, Tracy felt an inexplicable warmth. For the first time in his entire life, he didn't feel invisible. He felt bulletproof. "Climb on the back, kid," Arthur said, gesturing to the passenger seat of the Road King. "You're riding with me." Tracy swung his leg over the bike. Arthur climbed on in front of him. "Hold on tight," Arthur warned. Arthur revved the engine, the roar echoing off the brick apartment buildings. As if connected by a single nervous system, the other 59 engines roared to life in unison. The ground shook violently. Dutch took the lead position alongside Arthur, and slowly the massive steel cavalry rolled out of the parking lot, heading toward Oak Ridge High School. At 7:45 a.m., Oak Ridge High's senior parking lot was a theater of adolescent hierarchy. Trent Gallagher sat on the hood of his spotless lifted Ford, holding court. Brody and Colin leaned against the massive tires, laughing as Trent bragged. He felt completely untouchable. He had crushed the weird, quiet kid and proved once again that he was the apex predator. "I bet $50 the freak doesn't even show up," Brody sneered, tossing a football from hand to hand. "Let him stay home," Trent smirked, sipping an energy drink. "My dad, Richard, is inside right now, having coffee with the principal. If that deaf loser complains, my dad will have him expelled for instigating a fight. It's totally handled." The words barely left his mouth when a deep, mechanical tremor vibrated through the asphalt. Students paused. Conversations sputtered and died. Over the crest of the hill leading to the main entrance, a blinding sea of chrome headlights breached the horizon. They didn't just enter the parking lot. 60 Hell's Angels swarmed it with terrifying military precision. The roaring engines were deafening, creating a physical pressure against the chest. Moving like a coordinated strike force, the bikers flowed around the parked cars, forming a massive, horseshoe-shaped barricade that completely sealed the entrance. The lead riders steered directly toward the senior section. Trent's smirk vanished entirely. The bikes encircled his Ford. Trent, Brody, and Colin were suddenly trapped against the grille of the truck, boxed in by an impenetrable wall of leather, denim, and stone-faced men. The engines shut off simultaneously. The resulting silence was suffocating. Arthur Pendleton and Dutch Sullivan parked directly in front of Trent. Arthur killed the ignition. From behind his massive frame, Tracy climbed down, wearing the oversized leather vest. His black eye and jagged stitches were glaringly visible in the crisp morning light. Trent's face drained of color. He looked from his battered victim to the giant with the scarred neck, and suddenly the air felt dangerously thin. "Morning, boys," Dutch said pleasantly, eyeing the truck. "Nice rig. Daddy bought it, I assume?" Trent opened his mouth, but his vocal cords paralyzed. Brody and Colin pressed themselves backward against the hood, desperately trying to merge with the metal. Arthur walked slowly toward Trent. He didn't raise his voice or his fists. He simply stopped 2 feet away. "You're Trent?" It wasn't a question. Arthur pulled a clear plastic sandwich bag from his pocket. Inside were the crushed, shattered remains of Tracy's hearing aid. He held it up to Trent's terrified face. "My nephew says you stepped on this." I didn't," Trent stammered, his tough guy facade shattering into dust. "It was an accident." "An accident," Dutch repeated. He pulled out his smartphone and tapped the screen. "Funny. A dozen of our brothers here have their helmet GoPros rolling right now, streaming this little chat. We love accountability, Trent." Suddenly, the school's heavy glass doors flew open. Richard Gallagher, Trent's red-faced, barrel-chested father, burst out, flanked by a panicked principal. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard bellowed, marching down the concrete steps. "Get these motorcycles off school property right now. I'm calling the police." Dutch turned, a chillingly polite smile on his face. "Please do, Mr. Gallagher. We'd love to show Westfield's finest the St. Jude's ER report from last night. 2 broken ribs and a severe concussion." Richard froze, looking at Tracy's beaten face, then at his trembling son. "My son had nothing to do with that," Richard blustered, though his confidence was rapidly leaking away. Arthur took a deliberate step toward Richard. The sheer size of the biker made the wealthy auto dealer involuntarily step back. "Here is the reality, Richard," Arthur rumbled, his voice low and dangerous. "Your boy and his friends nearly killed my nephew and destroyed a $3,000 medical device. The local badge thinks you're untouchable. We are not the local badge. Tracy is under our direct protection." Richard swallowed hard, eyeing the 60 heavily tattooed men. "What do you want?" he whispered. "3 things," Dutch intervened. "First, you write Brenda Weaver a check by noon to cover a top-tier hearing aid and every cent of the hospital bill. Second, your son apologizes right now." Dutch leaned in, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "Third, if Tracy gets a paper cut, if someone looks at him wrong, my 60 brothers and I start taking our daily morning coffee breaks inside the showrooms of your luxury auto dealerships, every single day, legally, peacefully, and devastatingly for your sales." Richard Gallagher turned pale. He knew a daily biker occupation would bankrupt him in weeks. He grabbed Trent by the shoulder, his face purple with furious realization. "Apologize to him," Richard hissed. Trent looked up. The entire school was watching. There was no daddy's money to shield him now. I'm sorry, Tracy," Trent choked out, tears of absolute humiliation spilling over his cheeks. Arthur looked at Tracy. "Good enough, Si?" Tracy stood taller, the pain in his ribs eclipsed by a towering sense of power. He wasn't invisible anymore. "Yeah, Uncle Artie, it's good enough." Arthur raised his hand. 60 engines roared to life, a triumphant thunder that shook the school's foundation. As the bikers rolled out, the sea of students parted. Tracy Weaver walked through the front doors, leaving the shadows behind forever. Justice rarely arrives in the package we expect. For Tracy, it didn't come from the school administration or the local police, but on the roaring engines of 60 outlaws who understood the sacred duty of protecting their own. Tracy never needed to fight Trent again. He walked the halls with a new hearing aid and an unbreakable confidence, knowing that sometimes the quietest kids have the loudest backup. A towering, scarred Hell's Angel froze at a desolate Nevada gas station as tiny arms wrapped tightly around his leather-clad leg. Onlookers braced for violence, but the terrifying encounter quickly morphed into a heart-wrenching revelation, unearthing a buried past that would shatter the tough biker's world and change 2 lives forever. The Nevada sun was merciless, beating down on Route 95 like a hammer on an anvil. Heat waves shimmered off the cracked asphalt, distorting the horizon into a blurred, watery mirage. For Sarah Hayes, a 28-year-old widow running on fumes, both literal and metaphorical, the suffocating heat was just another weight pressing down on her narrow shoulders. Her rusted 1998 Ford Taurus sputtered and violently jerked before she finally wrestled it into the dirt parking lot of Roy's Oasis, a dilapidated gas station that looked like it had been forgotten by time. The engine gave one final, pitiful hiss as a cloud of white steam erupted from beneath the warped hood. Sarah gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles turning white, and rested her forehead against the cracked leather. She was exhausted. She was terrified. But mostly, she was entirely out of options. In the back seat, strapped into a faded pink car seat, sat 4-year-old Leora. Leora was the absolute center of Sarah's universe, a brilliant spark of innocence with wide, cornflower blue eyes and a mess of blonde curls that framed her face like a halo. She was clutching her favorite possession in the world, a battered, olive-green stuffed bear named Sergeant Fuzz. "Are we there yet, Mummy?" Leora's sweet, high-pitched voice broke the heavy silence in the car. "Not yet, baby bug." Sarah forced a smile, turning around to wipe a smudge of dirt from her daughter's cheek. "Mummy just needs to give the car a little drink of water, okay?" Sarah stepped out into the blistering heat, the acrid smell of old gasoline and hot dust immediately assaulting her senses. She checked her worn leather wallet. $34.12. That was the sum total of her life savings. It had to be enough to get them across the state line, far away from the nightmare they were fleeing. As she walked toward the rusted pump, a low, guttural vibration began to tremble through the soles of her worn-out sneakers. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a physical sensation, a rhythmic thrumming that seemed to echo from the distant mountains. Within seconds, the vibration grew into a deafening roar. Coming down the highway, cutting through the heat distortion like a mechanized cavalry, was a pack of motorcycles. Sarah's breath hitched. There were at least a dozen of them, riding in a tight, disciplined formation. The chrome of their customized Harley-Davidsons caught the desert sun, blindingly bright. But it wasn't the bikes that made Sarah's blood run cold. It was the riders. Clad in heavy denim and scuffed black leather, they wore the unmistakable 3-piece patches on their backs, the winged Death's Head logo, the top rocker proudly spelling out Hell's Angels. The pack downshifted in unison, a chorus of thunderous backfires echoing off the metal roof of the gas station awning, and rolled into the dirt lot. The dust kicked up in thick, choking clouds as they parked in a perfectly angled row, boxing in Sarah's broken-down Taurus. Sarah froze by the pump, the nozzle slipping from her trembling hands. The sheer, overwhelming masculinity and aggressive aura of the men dismounting their bikes was suffocating. They were massive, heavily tattooed men with unkempt beards, scars, and a hardened look that told of a life lived strictly on their own terms. Leading the pack was a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite. His road name, stitched onto the front of his cut, was Grizzly, and the moniker fit perfectly. Arthur Pendleton stood 6'4", with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the sun. A jagged, pale scar ran from his left cheekbone down to his jawline, disappearing into a thick, salt and pepper beard. His arms, thick as tree trunks, were covered in intricate ink, skulls, flames, and the bold letters AFFA, Angels Forever, Forever Angels. He exuded an aura of absolute authority and quiet danger. Sarah tried to make herself as small as possible. She kept her head down, desperately praying that the radiator steam would hide her. "Just get the water, pay for the gas, and leave," she chanted in her head. "Don't look at them." Don't speak to them." She unbuckled Leora and lifted her out of the suffocating heat of the car, setting her down by the rear tire. "Stay right here, Leora. Do not move. Mommy is getting some water from the hose," Sarah whispered frantically, her eyes darting toward the bikers who were now congregating near the station's entrance, lighting cigarettes and laughing in deep, booming voices. But the universe, it seemed, had a completely different plan. As Sarah turned her back for a split second to wrestle with the tangled water hose, Sergeant Fuzz slipped from Leora's tiny hands. The stuffed bear hit the dirt and tumbled a few feet away, rolling directly toward the heavy, steel-toed boots of Arthur Grizzly Pendleton, who had stepped away from the pack to light a Marlboro Red. "Sergeant Fuzz!" Leora gasped. Oblivious to the danger, oblivious to the terrifying reputation of the men standing just yards away, the 4-year-old girl took off at a confident waddle. Sarah turned around, the hose dropping from her hands as her heart violently slammed against her ribs. Leora was gone from the tire. Sarah spun around and let out a choked gasp of pure horror. Leora was standing right next to the massive, terrifying biker leader. Grizzly was taking a drag from his cigarette, looking out over the highway, completely unaware of the tiny human standing at his ankles. Leora bent down, picked up her dusty bear, and patted it clean. Then she looked up. Way up. She stared at the giant man in dirty leather, taking in his scars, his tattoos, and his intimidating frown. For a second, the entire gas station seemed to hold its breath. The other bikers stopped talking. The rumble of a lone, idling engine felt deafening in the sudden silence. Instead of running back to her mother, Leora took one step closer. She wrapped her tiny, pale arms as far around Grizzly's thick, denim-clad leg as they could go, resting her cheek against the dusty fabric. It was a full, uninhibited hug. Time stopped. The cigarette slipped from Arthur Grizzly Pendleton's lips, landing in the dirt with a faint sizzle. The towering enforcer stiffened, every muscle in his massive frame instantly going rigid. His heavy hands hovered awkwardly at his sides, as if he had just been handed a live grenade and had no idea how to defuse it. The silence under the gas station awning was absolute, heavy and thick with tension. Silas, a lean, heavily tattooed biker, wearing the Sergeant-at-Arms patch, took a cautious half-step forward, his hand instinctively dropping toward the heavy hunting knife sheathed at his belt, completely unsure of how to react to this bizarre breach of their perimeter. Sarah was completely paralyzed by terror. Her feet felt like they were cemented to the cracked asphalt. Visions of her daughter being shoved away, or worse, flashed through her panic-stricken mind. "Leora!" Sarah finally shrieked, her voice cracking violently. She sprinted across the blindingly hot tarmac, throwing all caution to the wind. She didn't care who these men were. She only cared about her little girl. She slid to a halt just a foot away from the giant biker, her hands trembling uncontrollably as she reached out to snatch her daughter back. "I am so sorry." "Oh my God, I am so sorry. Please excuse her," Sarah babbled frantically, her chest heaving as tears of sheer terror pricked the corners of her eyes. "She doesn't know better, I swear. We're leaving right now." Grizzly didn't move. He slowly lowered his dark aviator sunglasses down the bridge of his nose, revealing piercing, pale blue eyes. He looked down at the little girl still clinging to his right leg, and then slowly shifted his gaze to the terrified mother. "She's fine," Grizzly rumbled. His voice was incredibly deep, like rocks grinding together at the bottom of a fast-moving river. But to Sarah's absolute shock, there was no anger in it. Leora finally stepped back, looking up at the giant biker with a bright, entirely fearless smile. She held up her stuffed toy. "Sergeant Fuzz got dirty. You have dirty boots, too." Grizzly crouched down, an action that made him look even wider until he was eye level with the little girl. The leather of his cut creaked loudly in the quiet air. Silas and the rest of the Hells Angels watched in stunned silence. Arthur Pendleton was not known for his patience, let alone his gentle nature with children. "Is that right, little one?" Grizzly asked, his eyes locked on the stuffed animal. It was then that Grizzly noticed the necklace Leora was wearing. It wasn't a standard piece of child's jewelry. Hanging from a simple, braided leather cord around her neck was a set of dull, scratched military dog tags. Grizzly's breath caught in his throat. His massive, calloused hand reached out slowly, his fingers trembling ever so slightly as he gently took the dog tags between his thumb and forefinger. He tilted them to catch the harsh desert sunlight. He read the stamped metal. Hayes, Daniel J. Opus Christian. A violent shudder racked the giant biker's frame. The color drained completely from his deeply tanned face, leaving his scarred skin looking like ash. He dropped the tags as if they had physically burned him and stared wildly at Sarah. "Where?" Grizzly choked out, struggling to pull air into his lungs. He swallowed hard, trying to regain his composure, but his eyes were suddenly glassy and wide. Where did she get these tags? Sarah instinctively pulled Leora behind her legs, shielding her. They belonged to my husband, her father. "Daniel," Grizzly whispered, the name tearing from his throat like a physical wound. "Daniel Hayes." Sarah's eyes widened in profound shock. "How do you know his name?" Grizzly didn't answer immediately. He slowly sank from his crouch, his heavy boots scuffing the dirt, until he was kneeling on the hard asphalt in front of Sarah and Leora. The president of the local Hells Angels charter, a man feared across 3 state lines, was kneeling in the dirt, openly weeping. Thick, heavy tears carved tracks through the dust on his weather-beaten cheeks. "Because," Grizzly managed to say, his voice breaking completely, 12 years ago, outside of Kandahar, your husband carried my bleeding body through a mile of open enemy fire after our convoy hit an IED. I lost my leg that day." Grizzly reached down and firmly tapped his left shin. The heavy metallic clink beneath the denim echoed in the quiet air. "But I didn't lose my life. Daniel gave me my life." Sarah gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Daniel had rarely spoken of his tours in Afghanistan. The nightmares had been too heavy, the memories too dark. But she remembered a story about a man named Artie, a stubborn, foul-mouthed soldier Daniel had refused to leave behind in the burning wreckage of a Humvee. "You're Artie," Sarah whispered, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes. "I was." The biker nodded, wiping a massive hand across his face. "Before I came home and found a new brotherhood. But Daniel, he was my first brother." Grizzly looked around, his eyes scanning the empty lot and the broken-down Taurus. "Where is he? I've been trying to track him down for 5 years just to shake his hand, to tell him thank you." The desert wind howled mournfully around the gas station awning. Sarah felt her knees buckle slightly, the crushing weight of her reality crashing back down upon her. "Daniel passed away," Sarah cried, her voice barely a whisper. 8 months ago, leukemia. The doctor said it was from the burn pits over there. He fought so hard, Artie. He fought until he couldn't anymore." A collective, heavy silence fell over the Hells Angels. Silas took off his black baseball cap, pressing it against his chest. Behind him, 3 other bikers respectfully bowed their heads. Grizzly closed his eyes tightly, a grimace of pure agony twisting his scarred features. He took a long, shuddering breath, composing himself before he opened his eyes again. When he looked at Sarah this time, the sorrow had morphed into something incredibly intense, something fiercely protective. He stood up, towering over Sarah once more, but this time she didn't feel afraid. "Why are you driving a car with a blown head gasket through the Mojave Desert with a 4-year-old Sarah?" Grizzly asked, his voice returning to that low, authoritative rumble. His piercing eyes swept over her exhausted face, the bruised bags under her eyes, and the meager possessions crammed into the back of her dying car. Daniel's widow shouldn't be stranded at a place like Roy's Oasis. Sarah looked away, ashamed and terrified. She looked down at Leora, who was quietly hugging Grizzly's massive leg again, completely unbothered by the heavy emotional storm raging above her. "We're running," Sarah finally confessed, the dam breaking as a sob tore through her throat. Daniel's older brother, Richard. When Daniel got sick, Richard manipulated the estate. He took the house, he took the life insurance. He has a temper, a violent one. Last week, he came over demanding the last of Daniel's military pension. When I told him no, he put me against a wall. He said if I didn't hand it over, he'd take Leora to teach me a lesson. The atmosphere under the awning changed in an instant. The mournful respect evaporated, replaced by a suffocating, terrifying tension. It felt as though all the oxygen had been sucked out of the desert air. Grizzly turned his head slightly, locking eyes with Silas. No words were exchanged, but Silas gave a slow, dark nod, quietly slipping his hat back onto his head. The other bikers stepped closer, the casual, relaxed posture completely gone. They were no longer resting bikers. They were an army standing at attention. Grizzly reached down and gently placed a massive hand on Leora's blonde head. "No one," Grizzly growled, his voice vibrating with a cold, terrifying wrath that made the hair on Sarah's arms stand up, "hunts my brother's family." The blistering heat of the Nevada afternoon seemed to break, giving way to a strange, electrified stillness. Grizzly reached into the deep pocket of his leather cut and pulled out a battered, heavy-duty smartphone. He dialed a single number, his pale blue eyes never leaving the dusty horizon. "Doc!" Grizzly barked into the receiver, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "Bring the war wagon to Roy's Oasis on 95. Bring the flatbed, too. We have a pickup." He hung up without waiting for a reply and turned his massive frame back to Sarah. "We are not leaving you out here, and you are not driving another mile in that death trap," Grizzly stated, gesturing a thick, ring-clad finger toward the hissing Ford Taurus. "My brother's wife and his little girl are under the protection of this charter now. Whether you like it or not, Sarah, you have a family again." Sarah stood frozen, the tears drying on her sun-baked cheeks. Her deeply ingrained instinct was to run, to decline the charity of outlaws, but she looked down at Leora. Her daughter was now sitting happily on Silas's customized Harley, giggling as the terrifying sergeant-at-arms gently showed her how to honk the horn. The contrast was staggering, these hardened, violent men melting in the presence of Daniel's child. Within 45 minutes, a matte black Ford Econoline van and a heavy-duty flatbed tow truck thundered into the dirt lot. Behind the wheel of the van was Doc Harrison, a grey-haired, bespectacled biker whose knuckles were covered in faded medical tattoos from his time as a Navy corpsman. The Angels moved with military precision. Iron Mike, a towering enforcer with a completely shaved head, effortlessly lifted the heavy suitcases from the trunk of the dying Taurus, loading them into the back of the van. Silas secured the broken vehicle onto the flatbed. "Climb in," Doc Harrison said warmly, sliding the heavy side door of the van open for Sarah and Leora. "A sea is blowing cold, and there's a cooler full of juice boxes in the back. Grizzly's orders." As the convoy rolled back onto Highway 95, surrounded on all sides by the deafening roar of 12 Harley-Davidsons, forming an impenetrable steel shield, Sarah finally let her head rest against the window. For the first time, In 8 agonizing months, the crushing weight in her chest began to loosen. She wasn't alone anymore. 2 hours later, the convoy pulled off a dusty county road and approached a massive corrugated steel compound surrounded by high chain-link fences topped with razor wire. This was the Hells Angels clubhouse. Security cameras tracked their every move, and heavy steel gates groaned open electronically to let them inside. To the outside world, it looked like a fortress, but inside, it was a sanctuary. The interior was vast, smelling of motor oil, old leather, and stale beer. But as Grizzly escorted Sarah and Leora inside, the rough atmosphere immediately shifted. Grizzly called for a church meeting, the sacred mandatory gathering of fully patched members, while Leora was entertained in the recreation room by Doc and Iron Mike, who were busy losing miserably to a 4-year-old at checkers. Sarah sat at the massive oak table in the meeting room. Grizzly sat at the head of the table. "Tell us everything about Richard," he commanded quietly. Sarah took a shaky breath, spilling the dark reality of her brother-in-law. Richard Hayes wasn't just a grieving brother lashing out. He was a desperate man drowning in debt. He had a gambling addiction that had pushed him into the pockets of a vicious local loan shark syndicate back in Fresno. Richard needed Daniel's military pension and life insurance to save his own legs from being broken. "He's relentless, Artie," Sarah whispered, using Grizzly's real name. "He told me he had ways of finding me. He said he hired a private investigator to track my car." Silas, sitting to Grizzly's right, suddenly slammed his hand flat on the oak table. "The iPad," Silas growled, his eyes narrowing. "When I was moving your bags from the car, I saw an iPad in the side pocket of the kid's backpack. Does it have cellular data? Does it have a tracker app?" Sarah's blood ran cold. "The Find My Family app. Richard set up the family plan years ago. I never thought to turn it off." Doc Harrison, standing by the door, quickly checked a laptop resting on a nearby workbench. He tapped furiously for a few moments, running a quick signal sweep of the compound's immediate area. "Grizzly," Doc said, his voice completely devoid of emotion, a tone that sent shivers down Sarah's spine. "We have an unregistered SUV that just parked 3 miles down the dirt access road. 2 heat signatures. They aren't moving. They're watching the gate." Richard had found them. The nightmare hadn't ended. It had simply followed them into the desert. Grizzly stood up slowly, the leather of his cut creaking loudly in the tense silence of the room. The sorrow that had dominated his features at the gas station was completely gone. In its place was the cold, calculating fury of a wartime commander. "Silas, Iron Mike," Grizzly ordered, his voice an icy rumble. "Get the gates ready. It's time to welcome our guest." The sun began to dip below the jagged Nevada mountains, painting the desert sky in violent shades of bruised purple and blood red. The heavy steel gates of the clubhouse compound were left slightly ajar, a deliberate invitation. A black Chevrolet Tahoe kicked up a massive plume of dust as it sped down the access road, coming to a harsh, aggressive halt just outside the compound. The driver's side door swung open, and Richard Hayes stepped out. He was a tall man, but unlike Daniel's athletic build, Richard was thick and soft around the middle, wearing an expensive but wrinkled suit that screamed of misplaced arrogance. From the passenger side emerged Briggs, a hulking, brutally scarred enforcer hired from the Fresno syndicate. Briggs carried a heavy tire iron loosely in his right hand, his eyes scanning the seemingly empty compound with hungry anticipation. "Sarah!" Richard bellowed, his voice echoing off the corrugated steel walls of the clubhouse. "I know you're in there. The tracker led me right to this dump. Bring out the girl, hand over the bank drives, and we can walk away from this without anybody getting hurt." Silence answered him, only the faint whistling of the desert wind. Richard sneered, motioning for Briggs to follow him, as he confidently kicked the slightly open steel gate wide, stepping onto the Hells Angels property. Hiding in a biker bar? Really, Sarah? You think a bunch of greasy mechanics are going to stop me from taking what's mine? You're trespassing on private property. The voice didn't come from a speaker. It came from the shadows of the massive awning covering the garage bays. Suddenly, the floodlights illuminating the compound snapped on with a blinding electrical clack. Richard shielded his eyes, and when his vision finally adjusted, the breath was completely sucked out of his lungs. He hadn't walked into a bar. He had walked into an ambush. Standing in a perfect, impenetrable semicircle were 20 fully patched Hells Angels. They were entirely silent, their arms crossed over their massive chests, their faces stony and entirely devoid of mercy. The sheer, overwhelming aura of organized violence emanating from the men was paralyzing. In the dead center of the semicircle stood Arthur Grizzly Pendleton. He stepped forward, the heavy clink of his prosthetic leg echoing ominously against the concrete. Briggs, the hired muscle, instantly froze. The arrogance melted from his face, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. He recognized the death's head patches. He recognized the man leading them. Briggs slowly, very deliberately, dropped the tire iron into the dirt. It landed with a dull thud. He took 3 steps backward, holding his hands up in universal surrender. "I ain't getting paid enough to mess with the Angels," Briggs stammered, his eyes wide. "I'm out." He turned and sprinted back toward the Tahoe, abandoning his employer without a second thought. Richard was left standing entirely alone, shaking uncontrollably as Grizzly towered over him. "You're Richard," Grizzly stated. It wasn't a question. Who the hell are you?" Richard choked out, taking a panicked step back, only to find Iron Mike and Silas silently stepping behind him, blocking his escape to the gate. "I am the man whose life your brother saved," Grizzly rumbled softly, leaning down so his scarred face was inches from Richard's sweating forehead. "Daniel was a hero. He was a man of honor, and it sickens me to know you share his blood." "She owes me money," Richard shrieked, his voice pitching high with panic. "That pension belongs to the family." Silas stepped forward, pulling a thick manila folder from his leather vest and tossing it violently at Richard's chest. The papers scattered across the dirt. "We made some calls to Fresno," Silas said, his voice dripping with venom. "We know about your $200,000 debt to the syndicate. We also know you forged Daniel's signature on a secondary deed to his house while he was in chemotherapy. That's federal fraud, Richard." Richard stared at the papers in the dirt, bank records, phone transcripts, undeniable proof of his crimes, pulled by the club's extensive underground network in a matter of hours. Grizzly reached out, grabbing Richard by the lapels of his expensive suit, effortlessly lifting the man to his tiptoes. "Here is what is going to happen, Richard," Grizzly whispered, his pale eyes burning with a terrifying intensity. "First, you will sign a full legal release, right here, right now, transferring total ownership of the estate, the pension, and the house back to Sarah. Second, you will never contact Sarah, Leora, or anyone associated with them for the rest of your natural life. Third, you will get in your car and you will start driving. If I ever hear your name whispered in the wind, if I ever see your shadow cross a state line near this charter, you won't have to worry about your Fresno loan sharks breaking your legs. I will personally finish what they started. Do we have an understanding?" Grizzly's voice dropped to a guttural, terrifying whisper. Richard, sobbing openly now, his arrogance completely shattered into dust, nodded frantically. Yes, I swear to God. Just let me go." Doc Harrison brought over a clipboard with the legal documents, which Richard signed with a violently shaking hand, leaving sweat and tear stains on the paper. Once the final signature was scrawled, Grizzly released him. Richard collapsed into the dirt, scrambled to his feet, and ran to his SUV, peeling out of the compound so fast he nearly tore the bumper off on the gate. The heavy steel gates groaned shut, locking with a definitive echoing boom. Grizzly turned around. Standing in the doorway of the clubhouse, holding Leora's small hand, was Sarah. She had watched the entire confrontation. The monster that had terrorized her family, the shadow that had chased her across the desert, was gone, broken and banished. Grizzly walked over to her, his harsh, intimidating demeanor instantly softening. He crouched down once more, looking at the little girl holding the dusty stuffed bear. "The bad man is gone, Leora." Grizzly smiled, a genuine warm expression that made his scars crinkle. "You and your mummy are safe now." Leora let go of her mother's hand, stepped forward, and wrapped her arms around Grizzly's neck, burying her face in his leather vest. "Thank you, Uncle Artie," she whispered. Grizzly closed his eyes, a single tear escaping to trace a path down his cheek. He wrapped his massive arms around the little girl, holding the legacy of the man who had saved him tightly against his chest. "Always, little one," he promised. "Always." Sometimes, guardian angels don't possess ethereal white wings or halos. They wear scuffed black leather, ride roaring iron beasts, and carry the heavy scars of a turbulent past. A single, fearless hug from an innocent child bridged a decade of grief, proving that true brotherhood transcends death. In the heart of the unforgiving desert, a grieving widow and a hardened outlaw found exactly what they had both lost: a family.